Redshift here, doing my part to shift perceptions out of the pink and into the red. A very important point that people need to understand is the government has taken the place of God in people's minds. People view government as the ultimate authority, a legitimate authority. No matter how much it lies, no matter how many hundreds of trillions of dollars that it wastes, literally, the US has wasted $200 trillion. No matter how many millions of innocent people it murders, etc., people still regard government as a legitimate authority. It's fucking ridiculous. But women are built to obey authority, whereas men are built to rebel against authority, due to men having descended from violent apes who were the offspring of apes who overthrew the past alpha, and then one of those son alphas overthrows his father, and then he has tons of kids who in turn overthrow him. That's the way it works. Men are evolutionarily built to overthrow power, just like women are evolutionarily built to obey power, to obey authority. In the past, the ultimate authority in people's minds was God. Within, humanity, that is. Once humanity evolved enough to believe in God, that is, right? Which is probably way earlier than people think, because it's a superstitious thing, right? So you don't have to be very mentally evolved to believe in God, because, it's such a primitive thing, right? So it arose really early in humanity's existence, right? This belief in God. So, then men were second in command, in authority after God, right? So everybody believed in God, like God's the ultimate authority, right? But then men were second in command, and then women were third in command, and then children are at the bottom with little or no authority, except perhaps over their younger siblings. Although if a son was old enough, then his authority probably superseded his mother's, because of, men being more moral and it being a patriarchy, for obvious reasons. So now that we are becoming an increasingly atheist species, this means that there is a void left where our belief in God is supposed to be. This is true of men and it's true of women. Men respond by turning sex into their God when there's no belief in God in society, right? Like that need of the brain to believe in something as its God is still there. So it has to replace a belief in God with something else, right? So men turn sex into their God, because that's men's way of reaching the numinous in a concrete way, as opposed to drugs, which are a more destructive or more illusory and short-lived way of reaching transcendent states of mind. If a man falls in love with a woman, the honeymoon period could last a whole year. So that's a whole year of being on a high. Although I suspect that the more women a man dates, the shorter this honeymoon period will become. Eventually it might become extremely short, maybe only a month long, right? The high of the honeymoon period that lasts a whole year is far longer than the high from any drug. Even a drug like LSD or shrooms or peyote, which can clean you out psychologically so that you feel clean and free and like you're looking at the world in a whole new way. That state can last quite a while, right? On psychedelics. Once you're off the psychedelic, but you still are mentally and emotionally liberated, right? The high of the honeymoon period of a relationship even exceeds the positive afterglow that one sometimes gets after using a psychedelic, which is an afterglow that can sometimes last a few weeks, which is often how long it can last if you have a transcendent spiritual experience from meditating as well. The Dalai Lama described in one of his books about how he one time he was like, I think it was just out of the blue, he was hit by this realization. He said it hit him like a lightning bolt, this understanding of emptiness all of a sudden, which is what Buddhism is all about, training. You train concentration and you train analysis so that when you gain insight into emptiness through analysis, you can use that laser focus of the concentration that you developed to focus in on that insight and expand it and make it permanent, right? So this is and deepen it, and this is what Buddhism is all about. But so, once you meditate enough for, years and years and years, decades even, and you do it for hours and hours a day, sometimes this happens, right? You'll have an insight, just like a Zen master will have an enlightenment experience out of nowhere, right? And it'll just totally liberate him. And either he'll be permanently enlightened from then on, or he'll be at a higher level of enlightenment, or at the very least, like the Dalai Lama, he'll feel for at least a few weeks straight like kind of like an afterglow, like if you use a drug like a peyote or something. You'll feel this high kind of for weeks, right? So women and sex replace God in a man's mind. And this, or tend to. Like, men tend to deify women when they don't believe in God, right? Or men deify women even if they do believe in God, right? Like, because they're not taught, female nature, right? At least these days they're not, right? And replacing God in your mind with women and sex encourages promiscuity. Like allowing that in society, allowing men to replace God with women and sex encourages promiscuity, and it is gynocentric, and it therefore leads to a neo-dystopia eventually, and a non-functional society that everyone has to live in and suffer in, except for the elites who live cloistered lives in safe sanctuaries where food is safe, the air is clean, the people are polite, the neighborhoods are safe, etc. So men replacing God with sex, replacing God with women and sex in their minds is a bad thing. But women replacing God in their minds is an even worse thing, because then women view government as God, as the ultimate authority, which is a delusion that many men do not have. Women all think that government is good and necessary. Well, maybe not all women. Not all. You got a few women, like Brave the World and maybe sort of Blonde in the Belly of the Beast. You got a few women with common sense who do not have this blind faith in government and this blind adherence and obedience to government. But for the most part, most women view government as God, as the ultimate authority. They won't admit it. Even Christian women do this. They won't admit that they're viewing it as God. But when it comes down to it, they will act like government is their ultimate authority, and their ultimate power, and they will use government against their man and divorce him, even though the Bible explicitly basically forbids divorce, except for in instances of infidelity. But even if the man didn't cheat on her, she'll divorce him. So that's just proving that even Christian women, a lot of them who divorce their husbands even though he didn't cheat, those women do believe that God is not the ultimate authority. They believe that government is the ultimate authority. They believe that government is God. Essentially, that's what their actions say, right? And so women think the government is good and necessary. Almost all women. But not because women actually have given the topic any consideration, any serious thought. Women have not looked into the issue of whether the world would be better without government. Women instead assume that government is the ultimate authority, the ultimate power, and that therefore it must be good, and must be submitted to because it is the greater authority, the greater power. Women don't obey or respect men anymore because man is not her link with God anymore. In other words, women have a direct link with the ultimate power now. They don't have to go through a man. And the ultimate power at this moment in history is government. Women don't need their man's permission or the permission of their neighborhood before they can call the cops. They can just pick up the phone and call. They don't need the permission of men or the permission of the people of their city in order to get a divorce. They just file for divorce and it's granted. It may take some time, but it's basically a guarantee that they will be granted a divorce. So women don't respect men because men are not in line with the ultimate power, government. And women don't care if the ultimate power is out of control or oppressing men. Women only care when it starts to affect them, when men start to turn on women, as men are starting to do, because of women taking government side and not caring about men, and instead only doing what is in their own best interest, or rather what they think is in their own best interest, which is actually in their which is in their worst interest, and is in the worst interest of society. But they think it's in their own best interest because they're short-sighted and they lack wisdom, and so they do what they think is in their own best interest and they end up screwing up everything. If government were sane and fair and wise and not oppressive, not tyrannical, then yeah, women's view would make sense. But government is not sane, is not fair, is not wise, is not humane. Government is, instead, ruthless, stupid, monstrous, counterproductive, wasteful, violent, thieving, genocidal, dishonest, etc. And so while it would be good if men slavishly followed the law if the law were perfect, the law is far from perfect. And it's not only far from perfect, the law is almost pure evil. Laws are either unnecessary, in other words, superfluous, because the law is common sense and thus should not even need to be the law, such as don't kill, don't steal, don't rape strange women, innocent women, not your wife, that doesn't count. I'm talking, strangers, women who are strangers. Don't rape strangers, that kind of thing, Things which are obvious and therefore don't need to be written down as laws. The law is either superfluous because it's obvious, like don't kill, don't steal, don't rape, or the laws are not common sense and are actually tyrannical. Laws that are either tyrannical or superfluous. It's pretty much really that simple. So government law itself is inherently evil. Government law is pretty much always evil. So since the law is evil, this means that women's allegiance to government is either evil or foolish. And I would contend that their allegiance to government is both. It's evil and foolish. In some cases, it's just foolishness, and in other cases, it's just pure evil. But in most cases, I would say that women's allegiance to government is both out of foolishness and out of evil selfishness. Government is a parasite, just like women, and you can't walk away from the three-person argument of men, women, and government. No. If you walk away from government, and women, or you try to walk away from either one, they're both going to chase you, right? Especially if you try to walk away from women, right? Government and women will go after you. Government will try to, use its covert relationship with things like YouTube, Google, to, get you kicked off of YouTube so you can't make channels like, about MGTOW content. And women will start, going after you and trying to act like they're not that bad and that they haven't been oppressing you and that they're willing to change. And it's only cultural Marxism's fault. It's not women's fault that they've been divorce raping men for decades, etc. Now, if you walk away, the government and women will chase you. They both need the lifeblood of your money. They're both vampires. The government vampire may be in charge of the woman vampire, but they're both dependent on you. And they're both going to follow you and keep drinking your blood. There is no escape. There are only two options. Either number one, kill the master vampire government so as to turn the servant vampire, the female gender, back into a human being again, such as what would happen under anarcho-capitalism. Or number two, turn the servant vampire, women, against the master vampire government, so that both men and women together can destroy the master vampire called government. These are our only two options, unless we just want to continue being slaves. We must replace the government in women's minds. We must replace the government in women's minds so that women are no longer able to view the government as God. How do we do this? Well, we can either create anarcho-capitalism, get women to view the anarcho-capitalist system itself, the blockchain-based decentralized system itself, which the world would run on, as God, or we can get women to view human evolution as God, get women to view transhumanism as God, or you can kind of view that as the same thing also, right? The decentralized system and human evolution and transhumanism, it could all kind of be related, right? You can get them to view all of that as God, or you can get women to view men as God. Although men need to realize that instead of men being women's husband, who is ordained by God to be her master, which is something the men can easily do, it is far more difficult for men to be women's God. And such a thing would not be an easy thing for men to succeed at doing. I'm not saying it would be impossible, I'm just saying it would be very difficult. Or I think it would be very difficult. It would definitely be difficult, but, maybe the very is debatable. But, women themselves are very cruel, and they do not respect soft men. A man can only be a woman's god if he is willing to act like a god. That is, be very kind at times, very nice, and be very cruel at other times when she deserves cruelty or needs to be put in her place, right? Unless a woman feels utterly dominated, she will not view her man as God. She must feel utterly dominated in body, mind, heart, soul, and conscience, as well as her reputation being dominated by him as well, meaning that she is willing to submit to public embarrassment just to obey him, and also meaning that society around her condones all men utterly dominating all women and does not condone female freedom in any way, shape, or form. Only when a woman feels utterly dominated in every single way by her man will she be able to view him as her god. This might only be possible under anarcho-capitalism. And even then, if he totally dominates her like that, it still might be impossible for him to get her to view him as her god, because if he's not rich, then he won't seem like a god to her, right? Although maybe he still would be able to get her to view him as her god, but it's debatable whether it would work, no matter how dominant he is, if he's not rich also. And this kind of thing might be only possible under anarcho-capitalism. Because a man must be free to use whatever violence, embarrassment, or degradation is necessary to completely dominate his woman so that she is utterly submissive and utterly obedient and utterly devoted. Women are attracted to power. Only if all men have absolute power over all women will women be able to view their man as their god. If all women viewed their man not as their partner, not as their husband, not even as their master, but as their god, then men would not have to face the problem of women replacing the god archetype in their psyche with an outward thing like government. Because we have these archetypes in our psyche, in our emotions and our mind. They're always there, but they're present from birth, right? And our life experiences, who our parents are, how we're raised, the society we live in, what we do, how we're treated, all these things interact with these sort of like you might call them like a cookie cutter, right? Like there's nothing there yet, but the cookie cutter is a certain shape and it can create things in a certain shape, right? But the archetype itself can be filled out in different ways, right? So you have to replace this inbuilt archetype of God in women's psyche that they naturally have. Everybody has an archetype for God in their psyche pretty much, right? Or most people do. So you got to make that God archetype in women be formed in that they view men as their god. And this would be may be hard or impossible to do with women who are not virgins and who are already married and all the rest of it, but like, let's say women who are, 13 and under, we would be able to absolutely, once society is overthrown and we can make men have all the power in society again, then the women 13 and younger can be saved. They can be made to view men as God. They can be made to be moral. They can be made to behave perfectly as men tell them to behave. Kind, obedient, patient, faithful, etc. This can absolutely be done when women are young enough and innocent enough, right? So this needs to be said that, men won't have to face the problem of women replacing the God archetype in their psyche with an outward thing like government if men get women to view men as their God. And because women, replacing God in their minds with government, this is a thing that will eventually always usurp male authority over a period of decades. Because everything wants to grow itself, wants to grow its own power. And governments and corporations and even charities are all the same. They just want to grow. They just want to get more money, more power, etc. So if you allow government to arise, no matter how tiny it will always grow to monstrous size and then take away all men's rights. Men need to always put themselves and their gender and the human species itself as their first priority. If men only put themselves, or at least not in a hedonistic way, but in a profitable way, not in a money sense, profitable in a salubrious way, right? But they need to put women as a priority too, but in terms of forcing women to be moral, right? But once they're moral, then men can turn to making sure their gender is on the right side, that men are acting properly and have their focus on the right things, and that the human species is surviving and thriving and doing well, right? If men only put themselves first, then men will be divided, and men will consequently lose. If men put their gender first but do not put themselves first over their woman, then women will be corrupted and men will lose power, right? Men must look out for themselves and for other men. Men must take back power in society, must put all men in charge of all women, right? If even some women are allowed to be in power, then it undermines the power of all men, because then other women see it. They see that, there's a few women who are CEOs, there's a few women who are in parliament or senators or congressmen or whatever, and then they want to emulate those women. Now perhaps under anarcho-capitalism we can allow women to form their own businesses and do their own thing like that, because most men will shun such women and will make it clear to both other men and to women as a whole, as well as to those working women, that those working women are rebellious trash for not fulfilling their biological imperative and for setting a bad example for all women. So they'd be allowed to do it, but they'd be massively shunned for doing it, right, if they had their own businesses or whatever. Then those women would be forced to hire low-quality men for them, unprincipled men, dumb men, lazy men, as well as hire women. So those women's businesses would not succeed as easily, or if they did succeed, they wouldn't succeed as much as they would if they were not being shunned, right? And the few that did succeed would be ones that would succeed in spite of male boycotting of them. If all women in society knew that they would be ostracized, shunned, disrespected, etc., if they chose to have a career instead of marry and have kids, then few women would do it, and would instead choose to do what will get them respect and affection. That is, marry and have kids. Not to mention that it's their biological imperative to have kids and get those kids taken care of, and thus by marrying and having kids, they'll be doing the right thing for themselves as well, not just for men in society. We as a society are going to have to address the problem of the human brain being left with a void when it stops believing in God, in the supernatural, in fate, in destiny, in this kind of thing. While rational people can accept that there is no God, at least once they put enough years into seeking the truth and accepting the uncomfortable fact that there is nothing supernatural, but women are not rational and cannot easily accept it unless they are accepting it because they are more attached to being able to do what they want to do without fear of punishment by God or karma. If women want to do evil deeds such as cheat, hypergamously trade up, conform to the evil culture of a corrupt multinational corporation, etc., then women will become atheists so as to not have to fear punishment in the next life. Or if women are very much in their bodies, like most women are, and are not inclined to believe in anything that they can't see, or hear, or taste, or smell, or touch, if they're inclined to not believe in anything supernatural, then women like that may also be inclined to not believe in God or karma or anything like that. At least if it's socially acceptable to not believe in karma or in God or anything, right? But other women are naturally built to believe in God, and this is a large percentage of women. Maybe they're not so much built to believe in God as they are built to believe in something supernatural, something mystical, something beyond our understanding, something that is working for the greater good, etc. These women need some kind of authority to replace God in their brain, And if men are going to replace God in women's brains, then men are going to have to abolish the government and allow anarcho-capitalism to arise in its place. Then men can dominate women in all kinds of ways, and women will gain satisfaction and meaning in utterly submitting to their man. Women are patient and passive, and so when such a man, a husband, who takes the place of God in her mind, is not giving her any orders, she will patiently wait, and she will be naturally happy to do so. Men may dominate women with sex, with violence, with unexpected demands, with denial of sex, with societal embarrassment, with shaming, with moral superiority, etc. There's many ways to dominate a woman, right? But while violence is very effective, it needs to be done calmly, the way that you spank a child. A man should not spank or whip his woman in anger. Even if he's doing it to her as a punishment for her bad behavior, he should do so calmly. A lot of parents who still have the good sense to spank their kids do so in a bad way. They spank their kids while they're angry, instead of calmly taking their kid into the bedroom and spanking them. You should never spank a child in anger, and you should not spank or whip or beat your wife in anger either. She will not respect you very much if you do it out of anger. But if you do it calmly, then she will understand that it is just what she deserves, and that he might prefer to not punish her like this, but that her behavior demands that he punish her like this. And so he does so, even though he might not prefer to do so. And she will see this, and she will think this. She will realize that she did something wrong if he calmly punishes her. If he punishes her calmly, but if he punishes her while he's still angry, on the other hand, then she might not realize that she did something wrong, because she will instead think that he just lacks self-control and is weak enough to need to take his anger out on her. A man can dominate a woman with sex, but the older they get, especially her, the less effective it becomes. And as long as he gives her a child or two, then he can slowly transition her out of being his wife in the way that she was before, and instead transition her into being his helpmate in raising the kids, like a maid or a nanny who is also the head of the house, other than himself. He could then, if he can afford it, get another wife, a second wife. Not by getting rid of the first wife, but just by transitioning the first wife into a different role in the house, right? And he doesn't really have sex with her much anymore, right? And he gets a second wife, a newer, younger wife, who he mainly gets to have sex with and romance and all the rest of it, right? So if he can afford it, then he could get another wife who he then dominates in the same way that he dominated his first wife. The new woman will take the role of wife and will have to be utterly obedient to him. The old wife, the first wife, will be happy to not have to have sex with her man anymore because, she already had sex with him for 20 or 30 years, and so she's bored with it, right? And she'll be happy to just do her own thing. The first wife, who's now in her 40s or 50s or whatever, right? She would still be under her husband's authority, the first wife would, but she would already be masterful at obeying his rules, and thus, because he already forced her to be obedient and well-behaved, decades ago, right? And kept her that way for the first 20 or 30 years of their marriage, right? So she'll still be very obedient once he stops sleeping with her and sort of transitions his first wife into a new role. So she could, easily follow his rules and then do what she wants to do the rest of the time. Right? Not anything to disobey his rules, but she'd have more freedom, right? After he gets a new wife. And the new wife would be the one being broken in, being subdued and taught to be slavishly obedient to her man. The new wife would be the one having to have kids and be at her man's beck and call whenever he may demand something over the phone while at work, or whenever he's at home and makes demands in person. And the old wife would be able to assist the new younger wife in raising the new wife's kids, who she has with the old wife's husband, thus making it easier on the new wife and assisting the husband in making sure that the kids are raised exactly how he wants them raised, because the old wife would be like the supervisor, making sure that the new wife raises the kids according to the husband's specifications. She would be his little supervisor while he's not there, right? His first wife would supervise the second wife while the husband was at work, right? And if all men used technology to make sure that their wives had more daughters than sons, not a little more, but significantly more, let's say 50% more women or 30% more women than men, more daughters than sons, then there would still be enough women in society for all men to be able to get a wife and kids, even though some people have two wives. If everybody had two wives, then all you'd have to do is make sure there's twice as many daughters as sons born, and then everybody still gets a wife. Then you don't have any societal instability from polygamy, right? That's the problem with polygamy. Not that it's polygamy, but that it, steals wives from, good men, right? And that leads to societal instability. Those men often leave the country and then, war against other countries, such as is happening in Europe. Men are leaving the Middle East where they can't get a wife, and then they're going to Europe, right? This is what happens, right? But if you use technology to make sure there's way more daughters born than sons, then every man can get at least one wife, or even every man getting 2 or 3 wives or whatever, right? Like you could have each man have a ton of wives if you just had each woman have a ton of daughters and very few sons. Right? Although, at a certain point, it's ridiculous. You don't need 4, 5, 6, 10 wives. You don't need 1,000 concubines. It's ridiculous, right? So I don't think men should have any more than like 2 wives, right? And I'm not necessarily saying each man should have 2 wives. I'm just saying, like, if men wanted to have 2 wives, that could absolutely be made to work by just getting all women to have more daughters than sons using technology, right? So, like I was saying, if all men used technology to make sure their wives had more daughters than sons, then there would still be enough women in society for all men to be able to get a wife and kids. And thus the richer men of society could each get 2 wives, one from the age of maybe when he's 25 to 45 years old, and when she is 16 to 36. So when he's 25, he marries a 16-year-old girl, and then he's married to her for the rest of his life. But he gets a new wife when he's, let's say, 45. So he spends, his first... her being 16 to 36, and from him being 25 to 45, he has the first wife. And then when he turns 45 and his first wife is 36, and thus she's no longer very fertile, she's, because female fertility drops off at about, I can't remember, like 35 to 38 years old. I think it's like 36, 37 is when it really drops off, right? Or maybe it doesn't drop off in terms of fertility, but it drops off in terms of healthy fertility, something like that, right? So right about the time when she's no longer able to likely have healthy children is when he would get a second wife, right? And she's been married to him at that point for 20 years. She's probably not even that horny anymore either. So even if he did keep sleeping with the first wife, it would only have to be occasionally, right? And then, and her body would not be like super wanting to have children at that point anyway, because that's more like 33 to 35 maybe, and only if she's never had a child, right? So if she's had a bunch of children from age, like let's say 20 to 30, then her body's not going to want to have a bunch of kids at the end when he's no longer sleeping with her very much when she's 36. Because it'll be like, I already had a bunch of kids. I'm fine, dropping off with my fertility now and stuff, right? Then, like I said, he could get a younger wife when he turns 45, and then his new wife would be like, 16 or 30 years old or 25 or whatever, right? And then after that, once the new younger wife had also reached her late 30s, he would be in like his 60s or something, right? Like if he got married to a second wife when she was 16, then by the time he's 65, she would be 36, and the first wife would be 56, right? And so the younger wife, by the time she reaches her late 30s, her husband, he would be in his not late, but he'd be in his mid-60s, right? And he could just let both wives do their thing, spending time with friends, having their kids over to spend time with, etc. And he could be retired and could spend time with his kids and his friends and such. And he would no longer need sex because of his non-existent or almost non-existent libido. Because libido decreases in the 50s and 60s and stuff, right? Well, I mean, it decreases ever since you start puberty, but it greatly decreases in your 50s and 60s, right? Even for many men, it decreases in their 40s significantly, right? A lot of men get erectile dysfunction in their 40s. And his wives would be happy to not have to have sex with him anymore because of them both already having had 20 years of having sex with him, and because of the second wife being past her prime fertile years by the time she turns 36 and he's 65, and the first wife already being in at least her mid-50s, right? The top 10% of men could get 2 wives over their lifetime, and the rest of men could have 1 wife for their lifetime. Men with lower quality genes generally have lower sex drives anyway, and so by the time those men are 45 years old, those 99% men, or the bottom 90% of men, the guys who don't have huge sex drives, and by the time those guys are 45, most of them will have lost their sex drive anyway, or greatly decreased it at least. So where they might like having sex, but they don't need that sexual release anymore because their libido has gotten so low that it's not even really much of an itch anymore. It's just something so subtle that it can easily be ignored. And if prostitution were legal, like it would be under anarcho-capitalism, then those less wealthy husbands who could not afford a second wife and could not afford more kids, those husbands could use prostitutes when they got extremely bored of having sex with their wife instead of getting a second wife. And wealthy men who do have a second wife could do the same thing when they got bored of having sex with their second wife instead of getting a third wife, right? Each man having as many women as he could handle, and with there being enough women so that no men were unable to get women, would result in there being a stable society. Like I said, polygamous societies are unstable because of the fact that not all men can get women. Many men are left out in the cold. Many men are turned into incels by polygamy being legal because of the number of men and women in society being almost equal. But if technology is used to make sure that all men have more daughters than sons, then it would make it so that there would be no incels, no societal instability from men being unable to get women, because all men would be able to get a woman. If for no other reason than that there would be no welfare under anarcho-capitalism, and thus those low-quality women would want a man to give her sex and love, and take care of her, and get her out of her father's house, and give her children, right? And even if he wasn't going to give her children, she would still want to be taken care of, and be out of her father's house, and she would want to be loved, right? And those fathers would want to marry their daughters off also, and thus those fathers would not let their daughters get an overinflated sense of their self-worth, and would instead encourage those women to be realistic, and not turn down men who are of their own sexual marketplace value. In other words, their fathers would force those daughters to be accurate when assessing their own sexual marketplace value, as opposed to today, where women are completely delusional about their own sexual marketplace value, right? So this would make it so that even, 2 out of 10 men could get girlfriends or wives, right? Maybe they wouldn't be able to have many kids, maybe they'd have to get an ugly wife, but they would be able to get some woman of some kind because there being no welfare, and because of fathers being strongly incentivized by the lack of government to teach their daughters to be accurate about assessing a man's sexual marketplace value and her own sexual marketplace value, right? Not unfairly discounting men who are actually pretty good, and not overvaluing themselves, right? So this would be really, really useful. It would be very good for societal stability. It would be very good for making females humble. This would be very good in multiple ways for society, right? Under anarcho-capitalism, nearly all kids would be raised by their father as well as their mother. Being raised by their father, they would be told the truth about their value. If she was a 10 out of 10 on the look scale, her father would tell her that she's gorgeous, but that power corrupts, and that she needs to be very careful to not let her power corrupt her, or else she will end up miserable because of lacking virtue. Because morality is truly the only, criteria that makes a person happy or unhappy. You can have fucking cancer and be dying and be happy if you're a moral person. And you can be healthy and brilliant and charming and gorgeous and rich as hell and have every advantage in the world, and you can be miserable if you have no morality. So truly, virtue, morality is the only thing that matters in terms of whether a person is happy or not. That's the only criteria, really, that determines whether a person's happy or not, right? So fathers would tell 10 out of 10 girls who are super gorgeous, they'd say, yeah, you're really, really pretty, but, don't let that corrupt you, because if you do, you're going to be miserable. No matter whether you get everything that you want or not, you will still be miserable if you're not moral. And no really good guy is going to want you if you have a bad attitude anyway, right? Like, that's what her father would also tell her, right? So, and this would be extremely good for those 10 out of 10 women. It would be extremely good for the men who marry them. It'd be extremely good for all of society, etc. By incentivizing good behavior in less attractive women because of the good behavior of the very high quality, physically speaking. The women who are 10s out of 10 setting a good moral example for all the women who are less attractive. This would be really good for society as well, right? Like, fathers would tell the women that, they're going to destroy their relationship and their relationship with their kids and everything, if they have a bad attitude, if they're narcissistic and selfish, right? Their fathers would warn them, their daughters that are 10 out of 10, that, don't get a big head because of your beauty. He would impress upon her that her only real value is in her character. How honest, hardworking, patient, kind, generous, faithful, quiet, etc. she was. And his daughters, who were only 3 out of 10 or 4 out of 10 on the look scale, would be told by their father that they are not very beautiful, and thus they have to be smarter and harder working and more virtuous than anyone else in order to be able to get a husband and enjoy the privilege of getting taken care of, being taken care of, and getting to have sex and getting to have kids and raise them. And then women would view, marriage and having kids as what it is. That is a privilege. It's not a right. Women these days think they have a right to get married and have a great life and all the rest of it. They don't realize that it's not a right at all. And the only reason they're getting it as much as they are is because of wealth stolen by men by government. The government steals money from men. And then the government takes that money and turns around and gives it to unworthy women, low-quality women who are promiscuous out of wedlock and stuff, and helps take care of their kids, thus, propping up female value artificially and suppressing male value artificially. So, this would not be the case under anarcho-capitalism. So women would realize that, hell, it's actually a privilege to get taken care of for your life by a man and have to give him sex and have his kids and raise them as your profession. They would realize that's a privilege, and we really want to earn that. And so they would be as virtuous as possible. Virtue, morality, would be a woman's path to getting what she wants. And thus, women would be extremely virtuous. And this would incentivize other people to be very virtuous, including men. And this would make all of society infinitely better. But back to the subject of men with two wives. Those men who have two wives could be assisted by their old wife in how to best dominate their new wife. His new wife would be able to give him lots of suggestions in how to most effectively break his new wife's will, how to make his new wife utterly obedient, how to make his new wife very devoted and loving, as opposed to, the new wife just obeying in her actions but actually rebelling in her heart. The old wife would not be sleeping with her husband anymore, or would not be doing it very much, and would already know how to be perfectly obedient to him, and thus she would not have to worry about the new cruel but effective techniques she gives her husband. She would not have to worry about those techniques being used on her, right? Because she's already well behaved and he doesn't want her for sex and stuff, right? So she would know that those techniques that she would give to her husband would only be used on the husband's new wife, his second wife, right? Besides, the first wife would be too old, too jaded, and obedient, like I said, for those techniques to work on her anyway, even if he did try to use them on her. Women are sadists and are envious of younger, more beautiful women, and thus such an older woman in her late 30s or early 40s would be happy to help her husband cruelly dominate his new, younger wife. She would enjoy doing it for her own sadistic reasons, the first wife would, rather than doing so in order to help her husband because she wants to please him. Although the husband would have to be careful to not let his old wife usurp his domination of his new wife's soul. In other words, he would have to temper his old wife's cruelty so as to make sure that his new wife understood that he does love her, that he's not a pure sadist. He would also have to make sure that his new wife understands that he is in charge, not his older first wife, who is helping him dominate her. If men had absolute power in society, then an older wife would not go too far in trying to destroy the new wife, because if she did, and the new young wife committed suicide or ran away and was never seen from again, then the husband would get very angry at his first wife and might even kill her, or kick her out of the house permanently, or something very unpleasant like that. So if it were an anarcho-capitalist society, and men had absolute authority because there being no law, no consequences for one's actions other than the consequences that people are willing to dish out, then a man could hold his first wife accountable like that, and she would know not to go too far in waging psychological warfare against the new wife, the young wife. She would have to instead content herself in helping her husband accomplish his goal of making his new wife utterly submissive, obedient, and devoted. And that older first wife would have to content herself in being part of the authority that placed the new young wife under itself. And the new wife would not be under the authority of the old wife, but she would probably act like it, as if she was, because the husband would not allow his new wife to disrespect his old wife on the basis of the old wife having lost her looks or whatever. So the young wife could not throw her beauty or fertility in the old wife's face without being severely punished by her husband. And so the new young wife would automatically sort of be under the authority of both her husband and the old wife. And the old wife would gain pleasure and happiness from that fact, from that greater authority. But she would not abuse it because she'd be scared of the consequences if she did. And she would monitor the new young wife for her husband, especially when he was at work, right? And she would tell her husband whenever the new young wife misbehaved, which she rarely would because the old wife would be keeping an eye on her, and because she'd be being punished by her husband with spanking if she misbehaved. So the husband would not have to worry about his new wife cheating on him while he's at work, because his old wife would be keeping an eye on his new wife. And he would not have to worry about his old wife getting up to any trouble either, because his new wife would be keeping an eye on the old wife. And neither of them would give him much trouble because he would be able to use the trump card of violence against either of them or both of them if they misbehaved egregiously, or if they tried to team up against him. And they would have no police to call because there would be no government and no laws. All they could do would be leave, without their kids, and without any money. And being stuck in that situation would mean that any woman who would be willing to put herself into such a dangerous situation by marrying a man would have to be absolutely sure about the good moral character of the man who she marries. All marriage would, of course, be unofficial under anarcho-capitalism, as opposed to a legal government contract like today. Marriage under anarcho-capitalism would just be a family event where two people exchange a promise in front of their loved ones. That's it. And this incentivizing of women to choose men of good moral character to marry because of not wanting to be in a marriage with a bad man because she would have no government to resort to if she did, and if she left she would get no money and no kids. Like she'd have to leave her kids with the man, right? Because of that, this would incentivize women to choose men of good moral character to marry, instead of just women choosing men on the basis of how much money they have or status or charm, right? Then women would not choose men on status, charm, or money, but would choose men on the basis of their morality, and that's it, right? Their gentleness, their sense of honor, their all their good qualities, right? That women don't appreciate these days, right? So, and this incentivizing of women to choose men of good moral character to marry would mean that virtue would be incentivized in both women and men, and thus society would become far more virtuous, and society would consequently become far happier and more cohesive and more functional, and thus more peaceful and more prosperous. But like I was saying, the two wives would each stay aware of what the other wife was up to, and so they would be like the populace is now. He would be like the elites are now, that is, benefiting from the whole situation. The husband would be. And the two wives would be like we, the 99% are now. That is, divided against each other, which would benefit him, just like the husband, just like our racial, gender, and political divisions today are benefiting the elites. And if those more wealthy men who could afford a second wife had whether they were wealthy or not, all the men who could afford a second wife, whether they were, super rich or kind of rich or upper middle class or middle class, all the men who could afford a second wife, they could have brothers, right, who could only afford one wife, maybe. And those wealthy men could send their older first wife over to their brother's house in order to help the wealthy guy's brother train his wife. Like let's say the guy has, the older brother is like 10 or 15 years older than his younger brother, right? And let's say his younger brother doesn't make nearly as much money. He can only afford one wife. He's getting married for the first time at like 30 years old, whereas the older brother is like 45 and he's been married for like 20 years, right? So he could send his first wife over to his younger brother's house to train his brother's first wife, who he just married, right? To make sure that she's not rebellious and everything, or if she is a rebellious wife, who needed special attention to break like a wild horse, the old wife of the brother-in-law, she could help the guy who just married a new wife to, make his wife obedient, submissive, and devoted, right? So the older wives would probably not be bored being able to, because they could spend their time breaking other women for fun, whether it's their husband's new wife or their husband's brother's new wife or some other relative's new wife, right? She could spend her time going around breaking the wives, breaking in and training those wives and making sure they're good, obedient, loving, faithful, submissive women, right? And then there would probably be only like 10 to 20% of men who would have second wives, perhaps. And thus there would be a lot more men with only one wife. And thus there would be a lot of men getting married for the first time who are in need of an older wife to assist him in breaking his wife. And those older first wives would also be able to help break the wives of their sons when their sons got married, as well as assist their sons-in-law in breaking those old wives' own daughters, right? She could assist, her new son-in-law in breaking her own daughter and training her to be a good wife, right? Because she would have been raised properly to be a good, obedient daughter and stuff, but you got to also break her in as a wife, right? And so those old wives' astute understanding of women and of emotions in general would greatly assist them in making those husbands far more effective in breaking their wives, so as to make them good, obedient wives. And of course, once those wives are made obedient, then it will be easy to make those women virtuous. A virtuous woman is not always easy to make obedient, but an obedient woman, corrupt or not, can be made virtuous fairly easily, at least under anarcho-capitalism, where men can use things like spanking to force women to radically change their behavior very quickly and not go back on those changes, right? Because they fear the pain of being spanked, right? Then after enough time of being virtuous has passed, she will see that it actually makes her far happier to be virtuous, and then she will be virtuous for her own reasons, out of her own desire to do what makes her happy, that is, be virtuous, rather than merely doing it out of obedience to her husband. And that's when her virtue becomes real, when it is voluntary instead of merely obedient, and when it is wisdom-based rather than just obedience-based. Obedience first, then wisdom comes later, and then she can be obedient because she agrees herself that she should be acting that way. Because she sees with wisdom, through experience of having already obeyed and gotten good benefits, she sees that, and not material benefits, I'm talking like benefits in terms of happiness by being moral, right? Then she'll see that, being virtuous is powerful and good. It makes me happy, so I'll just be virtuous for my own reasons, right? I don't have to obey my husband to be virtuous. I want to be virtuous on my own, even if he didn't force me to be virtuous, right? And then women will be virtuous all on their own, and then all women will shame other women who don't act virtuous, and then women's own group preference will enforce female morality and will force women to be super moral. All women. Such men would make it so that their wives view them as being like Brahma, a benevolent ultimate god who deserves love and obedience, and husbands would furthermore make it so that their second new wife views his first old wife as being like the bloodthirsty goddess Kali, that is, dangerous and cruel, someone who must be feared and obeyed as long as Kali's commands are not a violation of her beloved Brahma's will. Women's sadism and ability to manipulate are tools that can be turned to men's benefit. Men just have to have the balls to overthrow government and allow anarcho-capitalism to arise naturally in its place. Men just have to have the balls to utterly dominate women and crush any female dissent. Once men have utterly re-enslaved women, then men can start the process of shaping women back into virtuous creatures and also of turning women's dark side into a tool to be used to further nourish the new naturally arisen patriarchy that grew in the fertile soil of anarcho-capitalism. Women only respect power. Women only respect ruthlessness. If you want women to behave, then you're going to have to either be very powerful or very ruthless or very courageous, or preferably all three. And you may think you have nothing to gain from this because you can just get sex without commitment, but I say that women will shut their legs like a bear trap soon, once MGTOW gets bigger and or a bit better known in the mainstream, to where most guys have heard about Briefault's law and hypergamy and solipsism, and women filing for most divorces and all other MGTOW truths. So once women shut their legs like a bear trap, the only way for men to get sex will be to either rape a woman, which will only work if all men start raping women, which will take major courage, more courage than men are showing these days, which means that men don't have the courage to do that these days, because all the courageous men are killed off in all the wars over the last 70 years. Or, if men use their courage to overthrow the government and thereby re-enslave women, as women utterly cave out of a desire to not starve and not go without children and not have to live at their parents' house for the rest of their life, such as would be the case if they cannot find a man to commit to them for life, because there'd be no welfare. So either way, if men want to be able to get sex, then they have to get their balls back, and either start raping women en masse, which is pretty psychopathic, and therefore I do not recommend it, or men will have to overthrow the government, because then men will be able to re-enslave women and make women virtuous again, and will be able to shape that new patriarchal society into one that men want to live in, one that works for nearly all men, and in which nearly all women are tightly controlled and kept subservient to all other men. Perhaps men of such a society won't refrain from fucking married women out of respect for those women, but will instead refrain from fucking married women out of respect for those women's husbands, out of a male own group preference based on the belief that males are morally superior to women, and thus all men are superior to all women. Even the dumb men are superior to the very smart women because men are morally superior, and morality is the only real judge of a person's worth. I prefer a moral person with a 75 IQ to a person with a 150 IQ who's evil, right? And everybody should feel the same way. Because you can have a functional society with a low IQ populace as long as everybody's moral. But if you have a high IQ society where everyone has a high IQ, but nobody is moral, that's probably a pretty psychopathic society. A society that is evil and makes everyone suffer, right? So that's no good, right? And like I was saying, men would refrain from having sex with married women out of respect for those men's husbands. Out of respect for those women's husbands, those married men. And men would also refrain from having sex with married women out of fear of what those husbands would do if they found out about that guy having sex with their wife. And men would also have such a male-owned group preference out of a wise view that all men benefit when men have such a view. When all men have a sense of honor toward other men, and when men all view men as morally and intellectually and physically superior to women. Men will realize that it benefits them and all other men, and when all other men have that same view, then they are helping all other men. And thus all men will rule all women in society, and all of society will greatly benefit from that, including women, who will hugely benefit from a society like that as well. So this is actually what is best for women as well. This has been Redshift. I hope you got something out of this video. I hope you're stockpiling styrofoam like I am. Peace trucks.